A few years ago, just before my final year of college, I went on a camping trip with two of my close friends, Danny and Miguel. It was late August, and we wanted one last break before life kicked into gear again. No deadlines, no classes, no stress. Just trees, stars, and silence. We picked a remote trail in the Adirondacks that led up to a high overlook called Echo Ridge. It was an official campsite, which meant no amenities and barely any trail markers. Just an old fire ring, a bit of flat ground, and miles of woods in every direction. Perfect. We hiked in with our gear, sweating through our shirts in the afternoon sun. Miguel had packed way too much food, and Danny kept joking he was going to toss his sleeping bag to lighten the load. We got to the site just as the sun dipped low enough to paint everything gold. We set up 2 tents. Danny wanted his own, while Miguel and I shared the other, and we built a fire before dark. That first night was one of those memories that sticks for all the right reasons. Smoke curling into the trees, crickets chirping, the three of us laughing around the fire, taking turns roasting marshmallows and passing around a half-empty bottle of Jack. I remember thinking how peaceful it was. No reception, no lights in the distance, no airplanes overhead, just us in the woods. I even remember saying something like, "Man, I wish we could stay longer." That second night made me regret those words. It started out the same. We cooked some of the leftover hot dogs and played cards until our fire burned down to glowing coals. But at some point past midnight, just as we were getting ready to crash, we heard something moving in the woods. At first it was faint, leaves crunching softly like an animal creeping nearby. We paused and listened. Then came a heavier step. Not fast, not running, just slow and careful. Pacing. Danny looked toward the sound and said, "Probably a deer." Miguel said, "Too heavy for a deer." We stood there, flashlights aimed toward the tree line, but saw nothing, just branches and darkness. Eventually we shrugged it off and zipped up our tents. I lay there for a while listening, but the woods had gone dead quiet. Not even bugs. I must have fallen asleep around 2 a.m., because when I woke up again, it was still pitch black outside. I didn't know what had woken me at first. Then I realized Miguel wasn't snoring anymore. He was sitting up whispering, "Did you hear that?" We both held still. There were soft footfalls outside, this time right next to the tent. A few steps, then a long pause. Then more. Someone was walking in circles around us. Miguel unzipped the tent quickly and poked his head out. I grabbed a flashlight and followed. Nothing. Then we looked at Danny's tent. The flap was open and he was gone. We thought maybe he went to relieve himself. So we waited. 5 minutes. 10. No sign of him. No footsteps. No flashlight in the distance. Then Miguel noticed something lying at the edge of the fire pit. Danny's sock. One of them. Just sitting there. That's when the unease set in. We grabbed our boots and lights and started calling out for him. "Danny, you out here?" Silence. We walked toward where we'd heard the steps earlier, staying close together. The woods swallowed our voices. After about 15 minutes, we reached a clearing we hadn't noticed before. Right in the center was a rotting log. Sitting on it was Danny's phone. Screen cracked down the middle. Next to it, his other sock. Miguel swore under his breath. This isn't right. We debated turning back, to pack up and hike out. But we couldn't just leave without him. So we kept going. Every so often, we stopped to call out. Then we heard something quick, staggered breathing ahead. We ran toward the sound, expecting to find Danny hurt or passed out. Instead, it stopped, like someone had held their breath. And behind us, twigs snapped. We spun around, shining our flashlights. Nothing. Then came another sound, running. Light footsteps, moving away from us. We were no longer searching. We were being watched. Miguel grabbed my arm. "We need to go. Now." We sprinted back to camp. It took twice as long because our bearings were off. But when we finally reached clearing, Danny was there. Just sitting on the ground by the fire pit, barefoot, shirtless, breathing hard. His face was blank. Mud covered his arms and chest. His eyes looked past us, unfocused. "Danny!" Miguel yelled, kneeling next to him. "What the hell happened? Where did you go?" Danny blinked slowly. He told me to leave my things. That's all he said. We didn't waste another second. We shoved everything into our packs, barely even rolled up the tents, and hiked out in the dark. The forest felt alive with things watching us. Every snapping branch, every gust of wind, it all felt wrong. By the time we reached the car, the sun was barely up. Danny hadn't spoken again. He just sat in the back seat, eyes half-lidded, muttering under his breath every now and then. We took him to the ER. They said he was physically fine. No signs of drugs, no head trauma, no dehydration. But he didn't answer any questions. Didn't even seem aware of where he was. That was 4 years ago. Danny never really came back from that trip. He dropped out of school, moved back in with his parents, and pretty much cut all of us off. No Facebook, no texts. I saw him once, randomly, in a grocery store 2 towns over. He didn't say a word, just looked at me and walked out. To this day, I don't know who or what he saw in those woods. I don't know who he was, or why Danny was told to leave the belongings behind. What I do know is that we weren't alone out there, and that if you ever find yourself hiking near Echo Ridge, and you see a clearing with an old log in the center, don't stop. Just keep walking. About 10 years ago, when I was 19, I went on a short solo camping trip near a lake in Washington. I just wrapped up my freshman year of college and needed to clear my head after a rough breakup. I grew up hiking and camping with my dad, so being alone in the woods never felt weird to me. In fact, it felt like the only place I could really breathe. I chose a secluded spot about a mile off one of the main trails near Mount Rainier. I'd gone there once before with my dad years back, and remembered it being quiet, with a great view of the lake, and just enough flat space for one tent. I got there by mid-afternoon, set up camp, gathered some wood, and made myself dinner as the sun dipped behind the trees. It was dead silent, no people, no dogs, no car engines in the distance. Just frogs croaking, water lapping against the shore, and the occasional crack of a branch in the woods. As it got dark, I lit a small fire and pulled my sleeping bag out next to it instead of crawling into the tent. I liked falling asleep under the stars, and it was a clear night. Sometime around 11, I heard something unusual, crunching footsteps in the distance. At first I assumed it was an animal, but the steps were deliberate. Bipedal. They stopped, then started again, then stopped. I sat up slowly and turned off my headlamp to listen. Whoever it was didn't have a flashlight, and they weren't calling out or making any noise other than walking. Eventually, the steps faded. I figured maybe it was another solo camper scouting a site, or just someone heading back to the trailhead. Still, I stayed awake a while longer, holding my little hatchet under the sleeping bag just in case. I must have nodded off at some point, because I woke up a couple hours later to the sound of another fire crackling. Only it wasn't mine. I sat up fast, my heart pounding. Across the lake, maybe 200 feet away, I could see the faint orange glow of a fire, low to the ground. Steady, definitely not an accidental blaze. There hadn't been anyone else out there when I arrived. No cars in the lot, no other campers on the way in, and no sound of a tent being set up or wood being chopped. I stared across the water, trying to make out a figure. The firelight flickered, but I couldn't see anyone standing near it. Still, someone had to be tending it. It hadn't been there earlier. It stayed lit for maybe 20 minutes. Then, just like that, it went out. Not like someone doused it with water, more like it was slowly snuffed out. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I crossed to the other side of the lake to check it out. I told myself it was probably nothing, a fisherman or another camper I just didn't notice. But when I got to the spot where the fire had been, there was nothing. No ashes, no soot, no disturbed ground, no ring of rocks, no footprints. It looked completely untouched, like the fire had never existed. I tried to shake it off. Maybe the fire had been further down the shore, and I just misjudged the distance. I stuck to my original plan and stayed another night. That evening, just as the sun went down, I made a slightly bigger fire and sat with my back to a tree, keeping watch in all directions. The lake was still. Everything felt normal. Then I looked to the left side of the lake, the wooded slope that led down to water, and I saw him. A man, just standing there at the edge of the trees. He was facing the lake, not directly at me, and he wasn't moving. He wore a tan jacket, maybe canvas, and dark pants. He didn't have a backpack or any visible gear. I watched him for what felt like minutes. He didn't sit, didn't move closer, just stood with his arms at his sides. Eventually, I got up and shouted, "Hey, you okay over there?" No response. Need help? Still nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward him, but the beam hit nothing. He was gone, like he'd never been there at all. I scanned the area, heart pounding. Maybe he stepped back into the trees. Maybe I imagined it. I don't know. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat up the fire, roaring, and my hatchet in hand, eyes locked on the woods across the lake. I didn't hear anything, but that feeling, like someone was watching, never left. Just before dawn, I packed everything up and left. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to get back to my car and forget the whole thing. About halfway down the trail, I passed a tree that made me stop in my tracks. There, carved into bark, was a crude symbol, a circle with a slash through it, and just below it in blocky, jagged letters, "Stay quiet." It was fresh. The bark was still raw and pale around the letters. I don't know what happened out there. I don't know who the man by the fire was, or if he was ever really there. Maybe it was someone playing games, trying to scare off campers. Maybe I wasn't alone after all, but I haven't been camping alone since, and I haven't gone back to that lake. About 10 years ago, I worked seasonal forestry jobs in the Pacific Northwest. It was tough, remote work, sometimes hiking 10, 15 miles into logging territory to assess soil and tree health. I spent more nights than I can count camped out in the middle of nowhere. Most of the time, it was just me and another guy, sometimes two, but there was one trip where I went alone. This wasn't unusual. We had solo assignments all the time, as long as the radios were working and we checked in at the end of each day. That particular week, I was stationed in a heavily forested area near Mount Rainier. The company had an old service road that snaked deep into the woods, mostly used by logging trucks decades ago. It hadn't been maintained in years, so I had to park my truck about 4 miles out and hike the rest with my gear. By the time I made camp near a dried-up creek bed, the sun was already dropping behind the trees. I set up my tent, ate a protein bar, and climbed inside just after dark. The woods were quiet. No wind, no insects buzzing. Just that eerie, weighty kind of silence you only get way out in the wild. I was starting to drift off when I heard it. Footsteps, crunching in the dry leaves, slow and deliberate, like someone trying not to be heard. I held my breath. It was faint, maybe 30, 40 feet from the tent. Then it stopped. No animal sound, no follow-up steps. Just silence again. I told myself it could have been a deer, or even an echo of my own movement earlier that was just now echoing down a slope. I closed my eyes and managed to fall asleep. The next day was uneventful. I spent it collecting samples, taking notes, and mapping tree density. By late afternoon, I was heading back to camp when I noticed something weird near the creek bed. Something that hadn't been there the day before. A trail of small, flat stones had been laid in a neat, winding path that led right up to my tent. Not randomly scattered, laid out, deliberately. I crouched down and looked closer. The stones were wet and clean, like they'd been pulled right out of the creek, even though it was bone dry. It freaked me out a little, but I tried not to overthink it. Maybe I didn't notice them last night. Maybe I was tired and seeing patterns where there weren't any. Still, I barely slept that night. I kept hearing distant cracking branches, footsteps again, even what sounded like low humming at one point, but never close enough to pinpoint. The real horror started the third night. I had just crawled into my sleeping bag, headlamp off, tent zipped. It was colder than usual. Everything was still. Then, right around 1 a.m., I heard someone breathing. Not loud, just barely audible, but close, too close. It was outside the tent. Slow, steady breathing. I froze. My mouth went dry. I didn't dare unzip the tent or turn on the light. I just laid there, completely still, counting the seconds between breaths. They were long, raspy inhales followed by short exhales, almost like someone trying to hold back a cough. Then came the whisper, a woman's voice. "Are you awake?" It was right outside the tent wall, like she was crouching just behind the fabric. I didn't answer. "Can I come in?" Her voice was soft, almost polite, but strained, like it hurt to speak. I thought about yelling, about grabbing the hatchet I kept near my bag, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then laughter, but not like a chuckle or giggle. Just a single sharp breath of laughter, like she was amused by something I couldn't understand. And then nothing. The breathing stopped. The voice went silent. I waited, heart racing, until dawn broke. When I finally got the nerve to unzip the tent, I was half expecting to see nothing. But the first thing I saw was a long strand of black hair caught on the zipper. It wasn't mine. I packed up everything that morning, samples and all, and made my way back to the truck as fast as I could. But the forest didn't feel right. Every few hundred feet, I swore I saw something dart between trees in my peripheral vision. Shadows that vanished when I looked directly at them. I didn't stop moving. When I reached the service road, I spotted something ahead of me, about 100 feet off. It was a woman, standing in the middle of the road, long black hair, wearing a pale dress that looked yellow with dirt. She wasn't moving, just standing there, facing me. I stopped dead in my tracks. I couldn't see her face clearly. The shadows from the canopy were too thick. I took one cautious step forward, and she stepped backward. I stopped again. She mirrored me. That's when I realized she wasn't watching me. She was waiting for me. I cut into the woods and bushwhacked the rest of the way to the truck. It took an extra 20 minutes, and I came out with cuts on my arms and burrs on my clothes, but I didn't care. When I reached the truck, I threw my gear in the bed and peeled out of there. I never went back. I filed my reports and asked to be reassigned. When I told my supervisor what happened, he didn't laugh or act surprised. He just nodded and said, "You were on the South Ridge, right? Off the decommissioned fire road." I said, "Yeah." He hesitated for a second, then said, "Don't worry. We don't send people out that way anymore." That was it. No explanation. No warning. To this day, I still don't know who or what I encountered in those woods. I've told this story a few times, and people always ask the same thing. Why didn't you try to talk to her? I think the real question is, why did she ask if I was awake? She already knew I was.